out of wood, there's no way you could do anything. Right. This bow, compared to this bow, have almost identical shapes up to this point. These are what we refer to as ears or sayas. What they are is cheaters. Like when you have a wrench and you're trying to pull and it doesn't work, you put a bar over the end of it and you pull it, makes it easier to move it. That's what these are.
Their purpose is to allow you to apply more leverage to the limb. In effect, it acts to lengthen the limb after the string has lifted up off of this portion when you're drawing the bow back. And then for the second half of the draw, you get the benefits of having a long limb bow. In addition, the geometry of having this sharp bend allows you to keep the angle that the string makes with the end of the bow always small. That makes certain that as you draw the bow back, it doesn't stack on you. And stacking just means that as you draw the bow farther and farther back, the amount of force needed to gain an additional inch of draw begins to go up dramatically. Suppose you've drawn the bow 28 inches, it may take another 10 pounds to pull it back to 29, then it may take another 20 pounds to pull it back to 30. Now with a bow that has this feature, it's much smoother. Once you've drawn the bow back to 28 inches, it may take an additional 5 pounds to pull it back to 29, maybe an additional 2 pounds to pull it back to 30, because these begin to act more and more like levers to load compression into the belly of the bow as the bow is drawn back farther. Unfortunately, it adds a tremendous amount of complication to the process of making the bow. This bow took 6 months to make. This one that John built took how long?
2 weeks.
2 weeks to build.
Now it's been curing out for a lot longer, but to build it, it took nothing at all. We'll get into the building process here in a moment. We want you to understand what's happening. So this, let's say, is a 70-pound bow, or 80 pounds. Let's say 70. That's about what I can actually handle. So let's say I can draw a 30-inch arrow in this bow at 70 pounds. Well, if I put sayas, or ears on the end, that just makes it easier for me to pull that 70 pounds. It makes it seem like 50 pounds possibly.
It's like putting bars or pipes over the ends of the bow and allowing you to pull it back with much more leverage.
So I can pull it as far, but it's easier for me to pull it. But in the process, we're adding weight, more mass, to the very end of the bow, so that slows it down. And so it won't shoot like this one will, is a 70-pound bow. If I put sayas on this now to help me draw it, it would shoot maybe more like what, 60 pounds?
60-pound bow. It'll be more comfortable to shoot. A lot more comfortable.
Yeah, much better. But now we can get rid of some of this. We can take this bow, which Jeff built, and instead of being 70 pounds, if I can handle 70 pounds, this could be maybe 90 or 100 pounds. Because the addition of these sayas, or ears, makes it easier for me to pull this and shoot it.
It's the problem that you have with discomfort is due to the stacking of the bow. And it also makes your shooting very erratic because as you tire out, suppose each time you draw the bow, you draw it maybe a fifth of an inch less than you had the previous time you fired. Then, since the stacking is so tremendous at the end of the draw length, for an average bow, a typical bow without these features on it, your shooting is going to be very erratic because you may be drawing at 29 inches at 80 pounds, then you draw at 27 and a quarter and it's only 75 pounds or less. So your shooting could become very erratic. This feature will make the bow much smoother to shoot. A remarkably heavy bow will seem very comfortable to fire. The one that we have completed down here, for you to look at, is a Turkish-style bow, Mameluke bow, and it draws about 100 pounds at 27 inches. It certainly does not seem that heavy when you actually draw the bow. It seems much lighter, but when it's been weighed, it comes up to about 100 pounds at 28 inches, 27, 28 inches.
They're two different style bows, the same concept, but you'll notice the sayas or ears are shorter on this one. And but you can see the amount of energy or force that's stored in this bow before it's drawn.
Now this one will look like this when it's strung, except of course these ears will be longer. And as you can see, it's not a trivial matter to get a string on something like this.
Now, there's special boards and methods of doing this.
In Indian mythology, the Indian god Shiva was killed when the saya of his bow split his skull after a rodent chewed the bowstring. So a certain amount of care must be taken in getting the strings on these bows. It's a good idea to have two people doing it and some special tools.
We'll get into this later. This segment, we want you to understand why we're making a composite bow, the advantages. I think you can see from our wooden, straight piece of wood, what we've done is we've utilized horn on one side, sinew on another side, in which is not visible in here. We have a piece of wood down the center, we'll show you in a second, that everything is glued to. That one short bow that's put up here, that has no wooden core. This is just sinew glued to the horn. You can make this faster, there's less work, but it's not as efficient. Jeff says as he strung this, it was like fighting a wildcat. The wood, besides acting just as a gluing surface, also acts as some stability, it appears.
See, the horn wants to compress as it's being drawn back, and the sinew would like to stretch. And if the two are being played off against one another, as you string up an all-horn, all-sinew bow, the entire horn layer will begin to compress, and the entire bow will physically shorten. Now, that's not going to be true on a bow like this. The median plane in this bow, the wooden strip that runs through this bow, will not compress. This is about the shape and thickness of the wooden strip that goes into the bow. This will retain its length as the bow is loaded and strung. Now, on the other hand, if you take a sinew bow with a horn belly and no wooden strip, the core of the bow is the horn, and the whole thing will compress quite a bit as you string it up. And the result is that the bow seems to be unstable. You'll have a large curvature in one limb that will migrate to the other limb and back and forth again. The bow will want to shed its string, and the result is that you have to get this bow strung up with some special tools, let it sit around to equilibrate for a while before you try to take the tools off and shoot it.
Okay. Jeff, why don't you go through real quick you got your core, your finished piece, your ears that you have, we're going to be squeezed, showing how to build it if we don't get going.
Alright, this is the wooden core. This is made out of a strip of maple wood, hardwood maple. Actually, it was a board, a 4x4, about 8 feet long, sawn in half. And
lift it up a little bit.
Okay. I have an unviolated growth ring on the back of this bow, and this is something that a technique that I got from John. It is probably not necessary to do in a sinew back bow, but John feels that it's a wise thing to do, and I feel likewise, that you should try to get the back of the bow an unviolated growth ring. So what I had done was targeted a flat growth ring in the board. Then all the material above it was shaved off with a spoke shave and with a plane. And then that growth ring and the one directly underneath it were sawn out of the board, and it was trimmed up. What you have at that point is, say, a 1 1/4 inch wide, 3/16 of an inch thick board. It's about 4 feet long. Then I had cut it to length and steam bent the ends using some tourniquets and some bending forms and gently steaming these pieces. And so you end up with a core which will form the neutral plane and the gluing foundation of the bow. The next step is to obtain some pieces of naturally curved wood or splice together some ears. And these are ears made out of ash. They had begun as naturally curved pieces of wood. This was actually a bend in the tree limb itself that had been sawed out and split in order to make two pieces of identical curvature and grain flow. Now these will be spliced with fishtail joints into the end of the bow like this, and you can see why that recurve is put in there. It follows the curvature of the ear extremely well, and it gives you about a 45, or in this case, almost 90-degree bend in the limb at the end. You can see that the line that runs through the ear in this direction is very nearly perpendicular to the plane of the flat belly of the bow. And so this will give you a piece of a core that's already partially reflexed. Now after that's been glued in with a fishtail joint, it will look roughly like this. And you'll have a piece that looks like this. Now later on, a reverse riser handle will be glued onto the back of the bow. And I generally do this later on so that it doesn't interfere with operations in the meanwhile. But the next stage in the operation, after inserting the ears and gluing them in place, is to put the horn belly on. And so we have some horn strips over here. These were corkscrew twisted up, and they've been steamed and flattened with heat until these are about 27 inches long, a little bit longer than necessary. You could probably get away with pieces 16 inches long. Now what we will do with these is cut grooves in them. Longitudinal grooves will be cut down the length about 10 or 12 to the inch. There'll be triangular grooves, and then mating grooves will be cut into this piece of wood, and the two pieces will be carefully fitted together, and then they will be glued in place to form the belly of the bow. And once this has been done, we have a bow here that's at that stage. This is the completed core with the horn strips on the belly. This is probably close to a ½ an inch thick, but it's going to be shaved down now on both sides until it's about, say, 5/16, and then about 1/8 of an inch or more of sinew will be added on the back of the bow, which is this surface. And when we're finished with that, this little space will be filled in. As the sinew dries and contracts, the bow is going to bend around until the limbs cross. And in so doing, this space is going to open up maybe 1/10 of a millimeter or so, which is why I generally don't fill it in until later on in the construction. But that's filled in with a piece of any hard material, hardwood, ivory, antler, horn, bone, whatever you'd like to put in there, even a metal piece if necessary. But this is the basic construction of the bow. Again, fishtail joint to hold the ear in, groove the back of the horn strip and the belly of the wood strip, and glue them together with a great deal of pressure. We generally bind these in place with a cinching bar and a rope. That's allowed to cure out for about a week, maybe 2 weeks, and then the bow will be sinew backed all the way up to here, along the entire back, up onto the ear, and thickly over the handle. And when we're finished, what we'll end up with is a bow that will look a lot like this one. And you can see the sinew completely covers the entire back of the bow. It goes well up onto the ear. In this case, it goes all the way nearly to the tip of the sia. This sia was made with a splice here and a splice into the limb there, Indian style, has a double bend. Then the section in the middle between the two horns is filled, and you essentially now have a bow that you could go out, cut nocks into, brace, put a string on, study the curvature of, and perform natural tillering on.
Well, let me real quick point out a couple things. One, you notice Jeff's been handling stuff on the right side. I've been handling stuff on the left side. That's because grease that's on your fingers or any place, these wooden bows I handle have got grease on them, will contaminate. The glues that we're using to put this stuff together, which under all this tremendous force wants to just blow apart, if you have any grease in there contacting this wood, if these wooden pieces Jeff was handling, if he had any grease at all contact, he'd have to start all over because you would not get the bond necessary between the two. So you'll find as we get into the construction, very, very, very careful. We'll be washing and cleaning every step of the way.
And resurfacing wooden surfaces between every operation. Immediately prior to sinew backing this core, we're going to scrape it down again with a razor blade to expose fresh grain, open up fresh pores, and eliminate any grease that may have been accumulated from our hands or from settling out of the air. You have to be extremely careful about this. We'll say it over and over again, but this is a good reason for bows failing. Contamination with grease. It's got to be avoided.
Okay, Jeff explained how he's going to build this composite bow we're illustrating here, and it's normally a